So yeah, thank you so much for joining me. This is a newer program that we started with the Mountain History and Culture Group, which is a nonprofit associated with the site that helps raise money for us for education programs. So it was actually Steve Nash's idea, who is our board president. And so we have been, interviewing different historians and public historians. He's been doing some, and I've been doing some. And you were automatically on my list, of course, to talk about interpretation and public history. So I'm really excited to have you join me. And really, this is just an opportunity to get together, talk history, drink coffee or not drink coffee.
This is just coffee. Oh, yes, coffee.
Me too. Me too.
So tell me, was I on your short list?
Oh, you want to know where you were on the list?
Yeah. I want to be on a short list. Hey, just getting on the list is fine with me, because we're talking right now. That's the important thing.
Exactly.
But we guys are competitive. We want to know where we stack up. But again, just being on the list, I'm fine. So again, here we are.
You popped up pretty fast on my list when I was thinking about interpretation. So you're on the short list. Don't worry.
Okay, beautiful. That's what I needed to hear.
So before we get too much farther into it, for people who are going to be watching this, I wanted to take a moment and let you basically introduce yourself, talk about a little bit about your background, how you got into this, and then, we'll eventually talk about the Slave Dwelling Project. I'd love to hear about that too.
Mm-hmm. My name is Joseph McGill. I am the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project, and more recently, I am the History and Culture Coordinator at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. I came here prior to having the two positions that I just mentioned. I was a program officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, working out of Charleston, South Carolina, in a regional office. Prior to that, I was the director of the African American Historical Museum and Cultural Center of Iowa in Cedar Rapids. The charge there was building a museum, raising the money to build a museum and making that so. And then prior to that, I was the History and Culture Coordinator, director at Penn Center on St. Helena Island, South Carolina. Penn Center was a school built during the Civil War for the education of recently freed people who were formerly enslaved. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, I was a park ranger at Fort Sumter National Monument in Charleston, South Carolina. Before that, I was in college, South Carolina State University, where I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English. And prior to that, I spent 6 years in the United States Air Force. So there it is.
I didn't know about that part.
Oh yeah, I got around, and as I am still getting around.
Yeah. Wow, you've been busy.
Yeah, and busy is good. I'm quite adventuresome, and I'm always looking for that next adventure. I'm not afraid of the unknown, so that's why I enjoy doing what I do.
I didn't realize that you were at all of those different museums and sites. Man, this interview could go on for a while. Tell me a little bit about the Slave Dwelling Project, like how it got started. Just what is the mission?
Yeah, I guess I can tell a little bit. I'll try to keep it to a little bit.
Take your time.
Hey, the Slave Dwelling Project. It's a very simple concept. It's finding slave dwellings wherever they exist in these United States and asking the owners if I could spend a night in these spaces to bring attention to them, because once upon a time one could go to an historic site, or more specifically a plantation, and engage only in the history of the enslavers, not necessarily the history of those who were enslaved. And I visited a lot of those sites prior to 10 years ago when I started the Slave Dwelling Project. And when I would visit those sites, I would notice a void in the narrative. They would talk about the grandeur of the house, the vaulted ceilings, the nice place settings, the architectural significance, and the owners and all that they did to make America great in their minds, and pass on to us all those historical things that they did, and telling us about all those folks. But what was missing was the stories of the people whose DNA that I possess. And noticing that was missing, and having a passion at the time working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and knowing their mission of saving places. But of course, those places were usually the house on the hill, the architecturally significant buildings, the stories of those usually white men in the narrative to support their efforts and causes. What was missing, was my story. Where were the folks who built that place, who physically built that place? Somebody cut down those trees to frame that house. Somebody made those bricks that's now that house. Somebody's labor was stolen for that nice, beautiful house to exist. Those stories were not being told. And having the background that I had, the passion that I have, the DNA that I have, the fact that at that point also in my life I was well into being a Civil War reenactor. And being a Civil War reenactor, we get the opportunity to go to historical sites, historical battlefields, and interact with people on those battlefields, whether it's a living history program or whether it's a battle reenactment. But above and beyond that, we got to spend the night at these historic spaces. So, spending the night in historic spaces was nothing new to me. Now, applying that concept to slave cabins was new. I mean, it was pretty creative. I must say, pretty brilliant. If you were to ask me, because that's not a thought that goes through a lot of people's mind. A lot of folks try to avoid such thoughts and doing such acts. So all those things came together at the right time. I wanted to launch this thing, but the thing that gave me the incentive to launch was the fact that while I was employed at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, my hours got cut. Instead of working 4 days a week, instead of working 5 days a week, I got cut to 4 days a week. And that gave me that incentive, that oomph, if you will, knowing that I needed to do something to compensate. So those things came together at the right time 10 years ago. And that's when I launched. So this year, 2010, we're 10 years into this thing, and we had great things planned for this year that are now being either canceled or postponed. Right. We're going to pick this thing up at the right time and do it in a manner that's safe and secure. We're going to follow the science and still continue to do what we do.
10 years. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. 10 years is amazing. And I didn't think 10 years ago when I slept in that cabin and woke up, on Mother's Day of 2010, it was not anywhere, nothing was going through my head that said 10 years later, you're still going to be doing this. Because my thought was it's going to be 1 year and done, because that's where my limited resources would allow me to do. I live in South Carolina. I knew that, acquiring that list that I acquired from the State Historic Preservation Office and making those phone calls to set up the stays, I knew that beyond that list, that was going to be it for me.
Right.
But then I started doing it, and then, you know, NPR, the local news. Well, first it was a local news. You know, they carried it, and then NPR carried it, and once NPR got up, you know, did what they did. You know, that genie was out of the bottle. It wasn't. It didn't want to go back in. You know, that bell could not be unrung. It was, and I found out almost immediately, right out of the blocks, that this crazy idea was a lot bigger than me, because, you know, this thing was doing what I wanted it to do. It was getting the attention to these places as I thought it would. Now, what I didn't think was that, you know, there were going to be those folks looking beyond the boundaries of South Carolina to, you know, to bring this same idea, the same concept to their sites. And I must commend those folks who got it early on, because they got it early on is why I'm 10 years later, you know, still doing this. And in this 10 years, there's been a lot of repeats. You know, I could leave a site, you know, 1 year knowing that next year I'm going to be back. So we kept building on those consistent ones and adding more and adding other categories, because, you know, it took a few years before I slept at the first presidential site, you know, which was the Hermitage in Nashville, Tennessee. Now we've got at least 5 presidential sites in the portfolio. You know, early on, I slept at the first institution of higher learning was Sweetbriar College in Sweetbriar, Virginia. You know, now we've got numerous institutions of higher learning in the portfolio. A lot of folks think like I thought 10 years ago. You know, you think slavery, you try to put it in a box, you try to keep it in a plantation in a southern state, and, you know, they're justified in thinking that way, because it did take a civil war in the 13th Amendment to end slavery in those southern states. But slavery also existed in those northern states. And when I apply the slave dwelling project to those states, I tend to get a lot of pushback. And that's when I have to remind them that, you know, prior to that revolution, they, you know, those states also enslaved people. But even beyond that idea and that concept, you also have to think about the westward movement and the Louisiana Purchase, and the fact that, you know, a lot of states once upon a time existed as territories, and there was a lot of lawlessness out in those territories. And in all this lawlessness, slavery existed. And I'm talking slavery of Africans. You know, folks will tell me, yeah, well, we were out west, you know, there was a different type of slavery. It was, you know, maybe some Native Americans. Yeah, maybe it may have been. But you also got to factor in that there was Africans being enslaved also. Perfect example would be California. You know, you think California that came into the Union in 1858 as a free state. And yes, it did come into the Union as a free state. But you got to think about the 49ers, you know, not the football team, the 49ers, the gold seekers. Some of those men were slave owners. They took enslaved people with them to California.
Right.
And it's by that definition, you can apply the mission of the slave dwelling project to the state of California.
The fact that it spread outside of South Carolina and spread so far, I think says something about just, well, one, the need for it and the want for it, that people were out there. Well, there are sites for so long that weren't telling the entire narrative. There have been people who have wanted it for a long time. And I think, you know, maybe they weren't, you know, necessarily sure how to get it or go about it. And so, you know, I think the slave dwelling project is just a really wonderful door to that opportunity for the public. What was the first slave dwelling that you stayed in?
Well, as the program, as the slave dwelling project exists right now, that first place would be where I currently am employed, the Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston, South Carolina, back in 2010. When I woke up on Mother's Day of 2010 in that cabin at that site, thinking about moms and moms of that period, and the fact that in this system of chattel slavery that they were a part of, once that birth to that child was given, that mother lawfully from that period had no more rights to that child, lawfully, that is.
Mm-hmm.
In the fact that so that was the very first place that I stayed. I've stayed in that place the most, and I go to work there on a weekly basis. So I've got access. It's like I've got the key. I can pretty much do a sleepover there, pretty much any time. Even in this time of crisis, if I want to do a sleepover tonight, I could do that. I was going from one state of South Carolina now to 25 states that where I've employed the slave dwelling project. But that first one is certainly revered the most and remembered more.
Remembered. You bring up motherhood, and that's something that I think a lot about at the Vance birthplace. We have the story of Venus, who was enslaved by the Vances, and we know she was taking care of the children. And so I think about not only were, these enslaved women often having their children taken from them, but they were also then expected to take care of their enslavers' children and raise them, and I think about that kind of how what that relationship was like, that Venus, we don't know if Venus had any children. She may have, and I mean, unless we find some documentation somewhere that teaches us that, we will never know for sure. But we do know that she played a role in raising the Vance children. When David Vance Jr. passes away, so Vance's father, there's an estate sale in the 1840s to settle business debts, because Mira, Vance's mother, couldn't hold business debts at this time as a woman. And so they have an estate sale. And Venus is one of the enslaved women who is actually put up on the auction block. And she, as the story, we know that's true because we have the estate sale records. We know that Venus is put up for auction, and we know that Mira Baird Vance buys her back for $1. So, but as the Vance family tells the story, so of course take it with a grain of salt, Robert, Vance's brother, says that Venus comes up to the auction block carrying Hannah, his sister, and says, "Anyone who takes me also takes my child." And, they say a hush falls over the crowd, and Mira Baird raises her hand and bids $1, and nobody, contests it, and Venus goes home, with the family. So how much of that story the story itself, we don't know. But I think about that so much when I'm in the Vance house. We have 2 cradles. I think a lot about how I can tell that story, right?
Well, what complicates it even more is the fact that those same enslaved women who were, giving birth themselves in many cases, and some becoming, wet nurses, and not only breastfeeding the enslaved children, but sometimes breastfeeding white children. And we transition from that to separate water fountains. Now, what sense does that make? It doesn't make sense to me, but that just show that we as a people are just so strange and superficial. There's a point in the lives of children where, all they see is another child. They don't see black or white. They see a child. They see a peer. But there comes a point where we get influenced by our parents or our society, and these separations start to exist. We gotta find our way out of that, because I've got to just organize a phone call to deal specifically with that. This assignment was given to fourth graders in this pandemic and schools being closed. Folks were just trying to figure out, well, how are we going to keep these kids engaged? Well, one teacher decided to include in this assignment to the fourth graders an essay of sort where they had to choose being an enslaver or an enslaved person, but write a paragraph. And then they wanted it to be, prior to the Civil War, you choose one of these and you write about it. And personally, I saw nothing wrong with the assignment. Okay, well, it went home with the kids, and an African American parent got upset, and of course, it blew up. I go around when I travel. We sleep in these places, yes. But before we sleep in these places, we have conversations around campfires. And a lot of times, often, this comes up in the conversation. When should we start telling children the real history? Not that sugar-coated, watered-down fairy tale type, stuff. George Washington cut down a cherry tree, honest Abe Lincoln. Yeah, they were. They did. They may have done those things. And I don't really know if George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. But that did make its way into the books. And we want to try to keep it there in that kind of comfortable mode, that comfortable place. But there has to be a time. And I'm hoping early on in the life of a child that we start telling them the real story, telling them about that, the fact that George Washington, he may have cut down that cherry tree, but he was one of 12 slave-owning presidents. That Constitution that we celebrate, that we the people, 25 people who signed that were slave owners. And when we talk about all men are created equal in that Declaration of Independence, 41 men who signed on to that were slave owners. Now, you signing onto a document that says, we, all men are created equal, and you're a slave owner, you're starting out wrong. That's a flaw that we're starting out with in establishing the base of our Constitution, the thing that, that document that we still live by today. And all that stuff is baked in our history. And I think we need to connect all those things to, figure out why we're dealing with what we're dealing with today. If folks are out there protesting and they're mad, I want them to know why they're mad. I want them to know that this thing has history. It's not our lifetime that we're all of a sudden dealing with this thing. This thing has legs. This thing has history.
Yeah. You speak of the being around the campfire, and it makes me think about when you came to the Vance birthplace.
Yeah.
So I was so excited to have the Slave Dwelling Project, have the opportunity to have you all at the Vance birthplace. Gosh, it's been a little over a year now. I guess it was spring of last year, so 2019.
Yeah.
But I was really impressed with the students that we had join us from North Buncombe, and just their thoughts and their reflection on it. And I think that's the important part of the nice thing about the Slave Dwelling Project was it's not just sleeping in slave dwellings. There was so much more. It was a full day long. I remember feeling exhausted at the end of the night because, I believe you were there by 11:30 in the morning. And at 11 p.m., we were sitting around the fire, and the kids had been there most of the day. We had done the tour of the site, and then they were in sessions. They heard Steve Nash speak on Reconstruction, and then, you had sessions led on like language and the use of language. So that part, I think, is extremely important as well.
Yeah, I remember well that occasion. I remember being impressed by the children. I remember learning things from the children. I remember learning. So I got a lesson in socioeconomics. A lot of the kids, although they did not look like me, we did not share DNA. but economically we had a lot in common, which made me realize that there are parts of these United States where we are equal economically, although we look different, from each other. As I recall, I don't recall them being any African American students being a part of that group. But again, as the conversation, wore on, I realized more that, this is a part of the world. This is a part of North Carolina. This is a part of the Carolinas. Although I had, knowledge of this place and in situations in economic situations like this, but to be a part of all that, to immerse myself in that was a learning experience for me, and what this project does, because as I stated at the beginning of this journey, I kept slavery in a box. A plantation in the South is where it was, where what I knew it was, and in my mind where it should stay. But now just being able to travel even within the state of South Carolina and just across the border in North Carolina, I'm still learning. Although I've been at this thing for a while, I'm still learning, and to spend the night at the Vance birthplace, a former governor of the state of North Carolina, and learn about his life. Oh man, he was a cruel man in my, in my opinion, as he applied his thoughts and process to that job. But these sites, they're all different. And although this portfolio that we possess for the Slave Dwelling Project is vast, it's all these sites are different. All these sites, the way slavery was applied to these places is just different. And I have fun just going and learning about them, and also being associated with Morris College, what we did with them while we were interacting with with you guys there at Vance, was a great opportunity too. And I heard you mention something earlier about some documentation that you have that help you tell the story. Now I recall the fact that a big part of why we were there is that we were talking about primary sources. Those sources that are in people's inventory that they know they have, and they know is the evidence that they need to tell the stories of African Americans, yet they still won't do it. So that's why I'm proud of what you guys do there, at the Vance birthplace, by not only acknowledging those documents but adding it to the narrative.
Yeah, I've been talking with a lot of other public historians as well, just about, that has been something that's really changed for me over the years. I've worked at other properties. I was at Mordecai Historic Park in Raleigh, and Historic Stagville in Durham for a little while as well. And I think when it comes to that kind of interpretation, there are those resources out there. But again, kind of how you were saying, you had slavery in this box. I think I almost had the resources in a box, if that makes sense. Well, these are the resources, and these are how they're used, and this is what you say about that. This is what it's saying. But being able to really step back for a minute and reflect and think about what other stories a resource can tell, I think it takes time, it takes learning, it takes maturity, it's a constant process. And when we talk about interpretation in public history and museums, and even when we're talking about racism, it's a constant process almost. I've heard it referred to tilling a garden, where it's never done. It's constant work. It needs constant, thought and care, and so I think I like to think about it that way, that it's constantly changing, that you're still learning always.
Yeah, I think part of the problem prior to the time that we started getting in a more comfortable place of telling the story, there was that comfortable place of not telling it at all. And not telling it at all, we tended to think, or we wanted people to think that either it didn't exist or it was not important enough to even be included in the narrative, the stories that we're telling you. But in telling this story, it can't be a general story. It can't be generalistic, because again, as you and I have concluded, that you can go to a plantation just across your property line, and that system was applied differently, at that particular plantation. And we also think about it this way, in that period in our history where one plantation ended, another one began. That certainly applied to the way it worked here in the Charleston, South Carolina area where I live and work. And as slavery existed back then, you could apply that same thought process to the all plantations that existed, and wherever these plantations existed, there's usually a river involved in the existence of these plantations. But even along that river, if you were to travel from plantation to plantation, slavery applied at that particular plantation was different when you look at the details, of the slavery that existed in that place. Sometimes you may have a larger number of mulatto enslaved people, and there's a story there, that one should tell, if indeed that is the case. Some folks were into the breeding business. Tell that story. If you think you lack evidence, look at the tax records. Look at the fact that there's census information. They probably won't give you a name, but you got a gender, race, and age. Use that information to incorporate the story into your narrative. Those primary sources.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, not only were the enslavers and the plantations different in how the institution was applied, but the people, like the enslaved people, were different. Like everybody's. You can't say like all enslaved people, reacted this way or did this or that. I think that part.
And that's a great point. That's a great point. Also, you got to think about extracting them from Africa. Some people look at Africa and say, well, they were all the same. No, they weren't. Right. When you look at the fact that, yes, there were Africans selling Africans to the buyers, but these Africans were selling folks that were different from them. They're the people that they defeated. And in defeating these people, they're bringing people into their world that they're going to enslave. You bring in a different set of people into your society. And some of these difference between Africans and Africans is that, sometimes they didn't speak the same language. Yeah. Some people assume that they did, but that wasn't the case. So the point there, even amongst the Africans themselves, they were different. And I think if people can understand that, they can, understand a whole lot more that, that these folks, yes, are being brought in and put into this system of chattel slavery, but there's still a lot of unknown to them. Not only are they being extracted from their homeland, they're being inserted amongst people who look like them, but they're different. Sometimes these people they're being inserted amongst are first, second, sometimes third generation enslaved people. So yeah, we may look alike, but there's still differences.
Yeah.